Hello and welcome to the Australian Roundtable podcast. It is Sunday the 18th of January 2015. This is episode 15 of our weekly broadcast live at youtube.com/Australian Roundtable from 4pm Australian Eastern Standard Time every Sunday, and also archived at ausroundtable.com for later listening. I'm your host Johnno, and I'm joined in the studio as usual by Ethan Nash of TOTT News. Thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
And we are usually graced with the presence of the Silver Fox Lindsay, but he is unable to join us today due to family commitments. As always, we wish him well and hope to see him again soon. But we do have some good news. Back by incredibly popular demand is our guest from episode 14, Zac A. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks, Johnno. It's great to be back.
Now, thanks to our listeners for spreading the word about the show. Our audience grows every week. So for any new listeners, I'll read out this short blurb that we like to start the show with. The Australian Roundtable podcast is a Brisbane-based independent news analysis discussion panel podcast which broadcasts live every Sunday from 4pm AEST. Episodes are available to listen to live and are also archived for later listening at both the Australian Roundtable YouTube channel and our website, ausroundtable.com. Live listeners can also take part in a live chat forum at the YouTube channel during broadcasts. The show usually features an eclectic panel of presenters who come together each week to discuss recent and topical news and current affairs from Australia and around the world. The show provides an alternative perspective to that presented by the mainstream media and is aimed at listeners in Australia and abroad who are sceptical of the official narratives being pushed by government and the corporate media. Views presented by individual panellists and guests are not necessarily representative of the entire panel, and each presenter is solely responsible for his or her own comments and claims. All important information cited during the broadcast will be linked to at our site, ausroundtable.com, so you can verify and analyse it for yourself, which I, for one, recommend you do. Episodes generally run to 90 minutes, and although it is a roundtable discussion, we do keep to a rough structure for each episode and generally focus on a small handful of discrete topics every week, and I'll get to today's rundown right now. We'll start off by taking a look at a quick update on the ISIS situation over in the Middle East, and then we'll get into our domestic segment, and we'll look at an update from the Sydney siege. Then we'll move on to dissecting the Australian government and mainstream media terrorism propaganda. That'll be a feature piece from Ethan, looking forward to that. And then we'll move on to discussing some more taxpayer-funded propaganda, this time to do with higher education so-called reforms. Then we'll move on to the international segment, where we'll give an update on the Paris event, and we'll also take an in-depth look at the Swiss National Bank monetary policy changes, which the significance can't be overstated. I'm looking forward to that segment as well. And then if we get time, we'll have a general discussion about where we source our information from and how people can try to find and spread the truth online and elsewhere. So that's a rundown for today, boys. But before we get into any of that, Zac, it's good to have you back. Ethan as well. I can see you're both struggling. It is a hot day today, isn't it?
The beauties of living here in Brisbane, the humidity is just through the roof. I don't know how hot it is at the moment, but
feels like 40 degrees.
It's a scorching summer over here once again, here in beautiful Brisbane, Australia.
It certainly is. And for the listeners at home, we do this show usually from my place here in St. Lucia. And I've just gotten used to having high humidity and high heat, and it doesn't bother me so much. But these two slackers were standing here for 10 minutes. Johnno, can we put on the aircon? You guys. Anyway, now enough of that. Let's move on to getting to the discussion now. ISIS. Don't know if you guys heard about this one during the week, but I read this one in the Daily Mail. So I'll give you a background to this. Now, our regular listeners will remember that last year on the ARP, we covered the corporate media's stories about how ISIS had rolled a bank in Mosul to collect a handy $500 million cold hard cash, and happened to just find a few hundred vehicles which had previously belonged to the US and her allies. Just happened to stumble across them in the desert. Cha-ching, cha-ching, these guys are off and running. And we also found out last year that ISIS was selling oil on the black market for big money. Well, here's the latest update. This is from the Daily Mail from January 17, revealed how the threat of ISIS is spreading. Quote, ISIS has almost doubled the land it controls in Syria since the US-led coalition began airstrikes against the extremist group in the summer, a new map has revealed. The extremist group has continued to expand its caliphate, despite more than 800 airstrikes hitting targets in ISIS-controlled areas since last summer. It is thought 1 million more Syrians came under ISIS's terrifying regime within the first 2 months of the bombing campaign, but the US and coalition forces had an Iraq-first policy and have focused their efforts on reducing ISIS's control there. However, the coalition forces are continuing with regular airstrikes in both countries. Yesterday alone, they conducted 6 airstrikes near Kobani in Syria, while an airstrike near Ramadi in Iraq destroyed an ISIS barge and 4 of its boats. 4 more airstrikes were carried out in Iraq, hitting buildings, mortar firing and fighting positions. A release on the US Central Command's website explained the strikes further limit the terrorist group's ability to project terror and conduct operations. End quote. So how do you like that one, Zac? They're limiting the terrorist ability to project terror and conduct operations, but at the same time, they've doubled in size.
Yeah, no, it's kind of unbelievable that they don't have some kind of external support. I would say someone, not sure who, is probably helping them, maybe funding them. I don't know. Don't want to give out details.
Well, as we've examined over the last couple of years in our own ventures, and as we've expressed here on the show, ISIS, the real ISIS extremists that are in these countries were funded by the West to take down Syria and Libya. They failed in Syria, but they're trying to get back in again, and it just seems like the evil regime, that the boogeyman that lives around every corner, Johnno, is only getting stronger because of the hatred that they have for us, supposedly, all of this propaganda.
It almost seems to me like sibling rivalry, where ISIS were the big kid last year, and then Al-Qaeda hit back with the Paris event a week or so ago, and now ISIS want to get back in the news. Hey, we've doubled our land size. Put attention back on me. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, most of our listeners know this is all just nonsense. And we wanted to start the show with that one because we like to start off with a light-hearted thing. And to me, ISIS is such a joke. Al-Qaeda is such a joke that even just discussing, how they get bombed and still double their land. I mean, if you can't see through this by now, you're never going to see through it.
Where did they get $500 million?
Well, they rolled a bank in Mosul. I mean, it's as simple as that. If you or I want to take out $10,000 from the bank, pretend that we have that amount of cash in the bank. We have to call up our bank in advance and say, we want to come and withdraw a 5-figure sum, right? Because the banks just don't have it on hand. Unless you're in Mosul, where they just happen to have $500 million just lying around.
In cash. Come
Cold,
on.
hard cash. So anyway, that was the opening segment, but we'll get straight into the domestic news now. And the first topic is an update on the Sydney siege. Now, we did say last week we're not going to cover the Sydney siege in depth anymore. It's in the past, and we've got individual projects that we're working on to release in the future. But this does deserve an update, because if you go back to episode 11, where we first broke down the Sydney siege, we discussed how we thought it was only a matter of time before this was used as an excuse to bring in an Australian Department of Homeland Security. Recall, of course, that after September 11, one of the first things they did in the US was bring in the Department of Homeland Security. So here's an update on the Sydney siege. This one's from the Sydney Morning Herald. That's a Fairfax publication in Sydney from January 12, 2014, titled Police Divided Over Strategy During Link Cafe Siege in Martin Place, Sydney. This is a short blurb. Just bear with me, listeners. I'll read this one out verbatim. Quote, tensions have emerged among police about the command strategy during the Link Cafe siege, and a late decision that has some officers believe put hostages at greater risk. Fairfax media has learned of the shift in strategy following the revelation that hostage Katrina Dawson was shot by a stray police bullet in the final shootout with gunman man Harron Monis. On the night of December 15, many hours into the siege, senior police drew up a direct action plan under which they would storm the cafe and take Monis by surprise. Such a strategy is high stakes and likely to result in some casualties among hostages, but the Tactical Operations Unit and other senior police had weighed up the risks of not going in, including changes in Monis' demeanour and the prospect that he would start killing hostages if police did not act first. There was consideration of proceeding with such a plan, but late on that Monday night, a command decision overruled that strategy. Instead, police had to adopt the reactive emergency action after Monis fired his first shot into the ceiling at 2:03 a.m. Monis fired as a response to the escape of 6 of his remaining 13 hostages, end quote. And then the article goes on to outline a few other problems with how the police conducted the operation. As always, links at ausroundtable.com. Now, that one was from January 12, so the day following our last podcast. This article I'm about to read out is from the 18th of January, i.e. today. So it's been the whole week they've been doing this. Again, I'll quote verbatim. Sorry, this is from Questions Over Martin Place Siege Command as Joint Investigation nears completion, from the Age Again Fairfax. Quote, the New South Wales Police Force has defended the chain of command put in place during the Martin Place siege amid questions over whether state protocols for terror incidents were fully enacted on the day. Fairfax media has learnt some police have questioned why the head of field operations, acting Deputy Commissioner Jeff Loy, was not given a greater role alongside Deputy Commissioner Catherine Byrne, who ran the counter-terrorism operation to detain gunman man Harron Monis. When an incident is declared a terror attack, as was the case soon after Monis put hostages against the window of the Link Cafe and the Opera House was evacuated amid fears of bombs in the city, a terror protocol came into effect. The protocol contained on the joint New South Wales Government Police website states, in the event of a terrorist attack that requires the involvement of several government agencies, the State Emergency Operations Controller will take control and coordinate the deployment of resources. While some police have put the decision to grant Miss Byrne full control down to existing tensions at the top of the force, a former senior policeman said it was understandable that Assistant Commissioner Loy did not have a greater role because the incident was relatively contained compared to a large-scale attack like a bombing when more emergency agencies are required. The chain of command and communications between agencies, including federal and state police, is being scrutinised by the joint review announced by Prime Minister Tony Abbott and Premier Mike Baird. It is due to be presented to cabinets at both levels of government by the end of January. National security sources have told Fairfax Media that the inquiry may recommend the need for better coordination between state and federal authorities, end quote. So it's shaping up, Zac, like a classic problem, reaction, solution. Last week they told us, hey, we forgot to mention one of those hostages that died. We shot her. Now this week they're telling us, oh, and we probably wouldn't have shot her, but there were problems between agencies that we just couldn't sort out. Pretty clear what's going on here, surely.
They need more power to protect us, right? That's their solution.
Yeah, that's always the solution, and it's absolute textbook. The dialectic, problem, reaction, solution, and we called this on. It was actually reported in the mainstream media. We were just doing a segment on it, saying that they want to merge a number of agencies under one banner to create a Homeland Security for Australia. That was at the very start of these so-called terror attacks, back when they were just putting through the first stages of legislation here in the country. When that happened, that was the problem, reaction, solution. We need tougher security. Now, as this comes out, we need even more tougher security, and they've already put in the subconscious of the people, announcing that something headed by the Australian Federal Police could mirror the Homeland Security in the United States. It's already been in the subconscious. It's disappeared. But as soon as another event happens, once again, it's always out there, and it's always the same people that are behind it that serve the agenda.
I don't think there'd actually be much resistance if they tried to get it passed now. I think people are naive enough to believe it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you saw how you've seen the complete violations of civil liberties that the American Homeland Security has done since 9/11. It's been a complete disaster, and they want to bring something like that over here. It just seems like the descent into tyranny is just increasing on a daily basis, Johnno.
And they have this thing in America called the Department of Homeland Security, which was set up post 9/11. Supposedly a body whose entire job is to protect the homeland, right? And yet at the same time they have untold numbers of people crossing the border every day. So this myth that the Department of Homeland Security exists to protect the homeland is clearly that a myth. And it would be the same thing if they introduced a similar agency here in Australia. It wouldn't be about Homeland Security, it would be about something else. And you don't have to be too smart to work out what that something else is. And my interest in this, when I saw these articles and I thought, oh yeah, I'll update on that on the show. My interest is look at how obvious the whole media narrative is. It starts off on the first week, it's terrorism, be afraid, blah, blah, blah. Mourn for the people who were supposedly killed, blah, blah, blah. Get it ingrained in your mind that it's all real. And then every week since then, they've hit us with a different narrative to affect a different agenda. That they can get so much out of one false flag, they'd be crazy not to do it. When people say to me, do you really think the government would do that? I say, I would think less of the government if they didn't. I mean, knowing when you know how evil they are and what their ultimate agenda is, if they weren't doing this, when you see how much mileage they can get out of one event, they'd be crazy not to do it. And this week we've seen it ramp up. They're going to say this week and over the next few weeks, the police weren't well coordinated enough. We need a central command. It is so obvious what they're going for. So obvious.
Yeah. And they're already trying to refute the notion that snipers couldn't have taken the shot. And I've already heard from some sources that there was confliction between the snipers themselves and who was directing them, and that it's just continuously pushing the narrative that we need a central control base. It's all it is, more control under the false guise of terrorism, when we all know that that you've got more chance of dying of a peanut allergy than dying of a terrorist attack. Yet every single facet of our life has to be controlled, and this is just another step under the guise of fake terrorism that they're going to use to try and control us. And it should be resisted by everyone, because every single event is the same blueprint, and they're going to benefit every single time.
Absolutely. And so that was the update on the Sydney siege. And again, now For any listeners who are new to the show, episode 11 to date is our most popular show that we've ever done, up to something like 1,500 views so far. And we broke down the event at the time. We called it a staged event. We couldn't say definitively we thought it was a hoax. By episode 12, it was clear the whole event was a hoax. And since then, we've given a couple of updates. Sadly, there's probably going to be a lot more to come out of that event. So every week, there's likely to be a Sydney Siege update. But hopefully, we can only spend a few minutes each week and get on to more pressing matters. And that makes a nice little segue, Ethan, onto the next topic today, which is dissecting Australia government and mainstream media terrorism propaganda. Of course, this is related to what we were just talking about, but slightly distinct. I know you've got some material there. Please take it away.
Yeah, it's very related, and it segues really well because it follows what we've been talking about now since the beginning of the year in Australia, and of course accentuated by the recent events in Martin Place and in Paris. There's been a continued push to sell the false narrative that extremism, particularly in the Middle East, is A, predominantly Muslim and religious based, B, that religious-inspired attacks from particular Muslim groups and or ISIS-inspired lone wolf terrorists are a major concern to us for national security, and C, that we need greater security, such as the current metadata retention legislation in the Senate, to identify and stop potential risks. So this narrative, coupled with Australian mainstream media and their sensationalist propaganda coverage of these events, has programmed the masses into believing these three utterly ridiculous paradigms are reality in their purest form. Now, I'm currently working on an article at tottnews.com to debunk some of these myths and remind the audience of a number of factors, such as how extremism in the Middle East was funded by the West as a means to overthrow governments, and much more. There's a lot more that goes into it when you look at who was funding it and where it goes down. And we don't have the time to go through all of that today. But even if you believe the official story that there is boogeymen out there, that there's a boogeyman group of Islamic extremists coming for our freedom, I found a couple of articles this week in the mainstream media that challenge that notion, and I was so glad to see the Australian press promoting this, and they both attack the central arguments that we've had in this country. Now, remember that these are mainstream media articles and aren't even touching on the underlying mechanisms behind how the Middle East ended up this way, and still they completely dismantle the so-called justifications. So we're going to start with radicalization, that there's radicals in the Middle East, it's religious-based, everything that we've seen in the media. So this is an article from Anne Alley from The Guardian on January 14th. For at least a decade, the issue of young Muslims becoming radicalized towards violent extremism has been one of concern for academics and practitioners like me. While we work on a daily basis to find ways to prevent radicalization or intervene in the radicalization process, occasionally the issue grabs the attention of the international media, usually in the aftermath of attacks such as the Boston Marathon and last week's shootings at the Charlie Hebdo magazine office. Global events like these shine a spotlight on Muslim communities who are placed in an unwanted position of having to defend their religion. Calls for Muslims to be accountable, take responsibility, condemn, object, speak out, reject, and prove that they do not condone criminal acts of violence often mask a more unnerving suggestion that Islam itself is to blame. And that's what, obviously, we've seen. A familiar pattern emerges in the wake of violent extremist attacks carried out by Muslim men. One that sees verses from the Quran being quoted out of context that support claims that Islam is either inherently violent or inherently peaceful. Indeed, the religious texts of Islam, like those of most religions, are filled with examples that could support either. Last week, on this particular journalist's Twitter feed, it became a battlefield of words between Islamic State supporters tweeting religious justifications for the Paris attacks, and the majority of Muslims responding with Quranic texts to promote peace and forbid murder. Now, this is the important part of the article. The fact is that the role of religion in radicalization and de-radicalization is grossly overestimated. There is actually no empirical evidence to support the claim that religion, any religion, and ideology are the primary motivators of violent extremism. The revelation that wannabe foreign fighters, such as the Ginger Dahadi, which we joked about here on the show, people like that are wannabe foreign fighters prepared for battle by reading copies of Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies, underscores this. The point has also been made by some of the world's most renowned scholars of terrorism who agree that other factors play a much larger role. Factors such as anger at injustice, moral superiority, a sense of identity, the promise of adventure and becoming a hero have all been implicated in case studies of radicalization. Religion and ideology serve as vehicles for a, quote, us versus them mentality, and the justification for violence against those who represent, quote, the enemy, but they are not the drivers of radicalization. Now, as this article has pointed out, and many of our listeners know, so-called radical extremists aren't born from religious circumstances. They are born from the environment around them. That is, a war-torn country that the West has exploited and used for the better half of the 20th century and still continues today. So right off the bat, gentlemen, one of the hottest topics at the moment that we see in the mainstream media is as baseless as it is inaccurate. What do you think, Johnno?
Well, look, this is a very broad topic, the topic of Islamic extremism in general. What is the Islamic faith? What effect does that have on young people? What effect does the way that they're treated in this country and others have on them? Very broad debate. I think your summary there is excellent. I can't wait to check that out on tttnews.com. I suppose for me, when I'm looking at this, taking a step back and looking at it broadly, I always look at the fact that they're running 2 or 3 simultaneous narratives that simply don't go well together. You can't, on the one hand, tell us that any Islamic person is liable to become an extremist if in the wrong, circumstances with the wrong teacher or whatever, and that we have to be fearful of them because there could be lone wolves roaming who become suddenly radicalized. You can't tell us that on the one hand, while at the same time flooding the country with Muslim immigrants and pretend that the laws that you're bringing in have anything to do with homeland security. You just can't run the two at the same time. Yep. And I think they skewer themselves by trying to run the dual narratives. And as you've pointed out, when it comes to Islamic extremism, a lot of what we see, like the genuine extremists in the Middle East, the ones who are real, not the fake ones that we see on TV, but the real ones, a lot of these people have every reason to have gone extreme, if you like, in the sense that it's their land that's being invaded by the defence forces that are funded by our taxpayer dollars. The extremists that we see in Australia so far, I think we've shown time and time again on this show, and there are many other people doing great work on YouTube and other avenues, is the extremists that we see in our countries generally are completely fake. The real extremists have their reasons to be extreme, and it all goes back to issues that are much more complex than simply saying that a Muslim person can become radicalized just like that. Zach, what say you?
Well, yeah, I think people can become extreme for a lot of different reasons. Violently extreme. There can be a lot of things, but I can definitely understand people being upset when their country is being bombed for decades and decades and their homes and families have been destroyed. It's understandable they'd be upset. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And I learned about this through journalist friends, some of which I worked when they trained me, such as John Corlett. I know Gary Sullivan, who was in Syria. They're on the ground reporting from a first-hand citizen journalism perspective rather than what the mainstream media has been telling me. And that is that there are extremists over there and there are people that are disheartened because there's drone strikes going off every day. Family members are dying. Your war-torn community, that the first world, if you want to divide it into that, first world, third world, it's all a myth. If you want to say that, the first world more than easily can fix that. They can fix the environments they're in, yet they're using them for an agenda. And when you feel like you're being used and everywhere around you is war-torn, of course you're gonna try and fight whatever it is you're going to believe in. But the mainstream media have been pushing that it's the Muslim religion that's the main driver for this, when we all know, and most of our listeners know, that's completely false.
Yeah, to the rest of the world, we are the terrorists. We're the ones that come in and destroy their land and destroy their lives.
That's right, and that's why I call Obama Obama. You know what I mean? Because it was a name that was deprived from the Middle East. Because that's exactly what it is. It's all about perspective. History is all about perspective.
Yeah.
That's why the Vietnamese don't call it the Vietnam War. They call it the American War.
Yeah.
Because America were coming... America were the invaders they had to defend themselves against. It's all a matter of perception, and when your perception is skewed by the mainstream media here in the Western world, you're never going to know the truth. And the truth is certainly not that religion's the cause of it.
I'm glad you bring that up with the mainstream media. I mix with people from Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran all the time in my field of work, and what I find fascinating is that for the most part, when you speak to them, they don't so much see Australians as the terrorists or Americans as the terrorists as they do the government. Like,
Yeah.
they're smart enough to distinguish between our corrupt governments who control America, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, probably France. That they can see that there's a distinction between those corrupt entities and the people that they govern. And it's fascinating that even though they're the ones who are having bombs dropped on them, even at weddings. I mean, it's an established fact that's on the record that the US Army has dropped bombs on weddings in the Middle East, supposedly to attack targets, right? They'll bomb an entire wedding to get at one target. That's on the public record. So even the people who are a lot closer to the action and see these kinds of horrors taking place, they're more able to distinguish, at least from what I've seen, between the corrupt evil governments and the people over whom they govern. Whereas so many people in this country who are plugged into the mainstream media can't make the distinction between the so-called failed states and their people. And I put that entirely down to the mainstream media and its ability to corrupt the thinking of human beings.
And they also haven't distinguished the difference between real extremism and the fake media extremism, the fake ISIS that was created. There are a group of extremists in the Middle East that were funded by the US, given weapons by the US to overthrow the governments. That region is unstable. There are people there. Atrocities do happen. There's real videos on the internet of executions and beheadings, not these fake ones. The media have then taken that and accentuated the fear and put it on a level that serves their agenda, a level that's not real. There's no air force. There's no way that the most sophisticated intelligence network in the world with the most powerful militaries in history would let a real threat like that do it. But it's become a threat because they've pushed it up so far that ISIS is now an unknown threat that's going to take over the world. That's something else that people need to distinguish.
Yeah. Well, I used that article earlier of ISIS doubling in size as a way to have a laugh to start the show, because we like to do that. We talk about some serious issues, so let's have a laugh, and let's be honest, ISIS is a laugh. What was interesting in that article, though, was they showed a map supposedly showing the territory that ISIS now controls in Syria and Iraq. And the point that was made in that article, and again, all links provided at AusRoundtable.com, was that one of the American generals openly stated, our strategy is to protect Iraq first. Now, think, like, they're openly stating that. That was clear from the start. They wanted to push ISIS into Syria. But think about this logically, even based on the words of this US general, stating, our plan is to get them out of Iraq. Now, where do you think they're going to go? They're going to go to Syria, which just fits in perfectly with the American plan of taking out Assad in Syria going back years. And that's not a coincidence. And anyone who thinks that's a coincidence watches too much TV. That's the only explanation for how someone couldn't put those two pieces together.
Yeah. Well, they definitely could have stopped ISIS if they really wanted to. They don't want to because the best way to destroy your enemy is have your enemy kill each other. You have two enemies, they both fight each other, you walk in, you win, you take the land, you take the oil.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's just basic divide and conquer. It's all throughout history, you know what I mean? And now that we've dismantled that myth that the mainstream media have been pushing, it's been programmed every day. The second argument of this, based on that, is that we need tougher security, we need more draconian laws to protect us from these Muslim extremists. And there was another article this week that once again tears that apart. Now, I'll move on to the second part of the argument. Obviously, as I just explained what it is, this is from the Sydney Morning Herald. This is a shorter article. I thank the listeners for listening to my voice. John Lawrence on January 12th wrote this article. While it is perhaps unsurprising, the Attorney General's latest attempt to use the Sydney siege and recent events in France as justifications for the government's mandatory data retention laws is as distasteful as it is misleading. It is difficult to know whether he is being deliberately disingenuous or whether his understanding of the detail of what he is proposing has not advanced significantly since his spectacular failure to explain it to Sky News presenter David Spears in August last year. And for those that haven't seen it, at AusRoundtable.com there will be a link to that video where Brandis is asked to explain what metadata is, and he stumbles on his words and is called out on his perhaps lack of knowledge that is a show.
And you think to yourself, he probably was sitting there thinking, hold on, you're a Sky, and you're a Rupert Murdoch boy, what are you doing asking me these questions?
Yeah. So since then, it seems like his supposed unknowledge, that's not even a word, but I'm going to use it because this Australian Roundtable.
That's 38 degrees, man. Go with it.
his lack of knowledge of this topic hasn't improved. Now, the problem with citing France and Sydney as examples, apart from leveraging a number of tragic deaths for political gain, as I pointed out on TOTTnews.com in the article Who Benefits from the Sydney Siege, is that they are in fact fairly strong cases why mandatory data retention may not be the critical necessity he asserts it to be. Two other recent, quote, acts of terror similarly point to the same conclusion, namely the Boston Marathon bombing and the murder of Lee Rigby in London the following month. In each of these four recent examples, the perpetrators were well known to police and intelligence agencies. The Attorney General quotes former ASIO Chief David Irvine as saying that access to metadata is, quote, absolutely crucial in identifying terrorist networks. As these examples clearly show, identifying the perpetrators was not the problem. In each case, it was rather decisions taken to not commence or to cease close surveillance of these individuals that arguably contributed to the failures of law enforcement and intelligence agencies to prevent each attack. That's not to criticise with the benefit of hindsight. I'm sure each case had a logical decision. He goes on to push the mainstream narrative. The US, Britain, France, and Australia all currently provide access to metadata. It's just not stored yet, as they're proposing. In Australia's case, this is not yet, of course, retained, but the latest figures from the Attorney General's own department show that there were over 300,000 requests processed in the year to June 2013, excluding requests from ASIO. So it seems, once again, this notion that we need tighter security and tighter surveillance of metadata, of just all online activity to track these people, is completely thrown out by their own official narrative because they were already on lists. They just somehow slipped off of it. So it's not the problem that they need to identify. It's their internal policies that have led to these so-called terrorist attacks.
Yeah, I mean, they already have plenty of power and plenty of capacity to track people. So why are they asking for more? If it's not working with what they have, maybe what they're doing isn't working.
Yeah, and maybe they should use the resources that they have to try and spy on the real criminals rather than listening to the Australian Roundtable podcast. Hey boys, if you're listening, good to have you guys on board as well, even if you are working for the feds. So Ethan, you've given us the breakdown there of the metadata thing. I know this has been one of your big topics right since episode 1 when we first started the show. Without going into your notes, just general off the cuff, why is the metadata thing for you personally such a big issue? Why are you so focused on it?
It's important to me because there's so many misconceptions with it, and it can be grossly misused, which it's going to be, and it already is. If people think that our data's not already stored in data facilities, that was exposed in the prison program, that our data is shared across, if people don't think that it's already happening, first of all, they need to educate themselves. But now it's going to become legalised, and for those who are unfamiliar, the Australian government is proposing that they're going to store our metadata on our computers for 2 years, mandatory of every Australian in the country. And from that, new data retention facilities are going to have to be built, which are going to end up eventually falling back on the taxpayer that we're going to have to pay for our own, surveillance. And it's concerning because right now any government agency can request to get access to our information without a warrant. Whether it be Medicare, Centrelink, whatever, any government agency, as I've just shown the official statistics of 300,000 in the 2013 period, 300,000 requests, they already have access to all of our data. It's just about storing it and being able to then use that to serve their agenda, and that's what's most concerning about it. And I'll be able to discuss it more once the Senate debates actually get the final recommendation back and the debate begins, because then we'll know the final outline for how they're going to store all of our data.
Zac, let's get your general opinions on this topic. The government having access to your metadata, how much does it concern you and why?
Well, of course it's concerning, and it's been concerning for a long time. They've had it for a long time. It's no surprise to me. And they could also get data from private corporations, your bank details, etc. It's not like the banks are going to stand up for your personal freedom and privacy rights, are they?
Yeah, that's right. And the thing I express to people is we have some of the most sophisticated intelligent networks on the planet. If you go up and look up in the sky, a satellite can identify your eye colour. And that was in the 70s. That's what they revealed. Imagine what they could do now. If people think that lone wolf extremists can just get these weapons, get these bombs, plan out these attacks without anyone knowing about it, they need to educate themselves, because if one of us tried to do the same, we'd go on the website to try and buy this stuff, and there'd be ASIO agents at our door.
And one of the things they never mention in the mainstream press or the corporate press when they're talking about Harren Monis, Boogeyman Monis, is the fact that he had a website. He actually had his... you don't need to access metadata to find out how and what that guy was thinking. He uploaded it all to a website that he hosted. So there was no secrets there. Now, if they're going to push this narrative that they need to get access to our metadata legally to stop terrorism, let them make that case, but only an absolute fool would listen to them say that and use Boogeyman Monis as their excuse when we know that he had a website. It's nothing to do with metadata. He was being tracked. The mainstream press were covering him 7 years ago. He was dismissed by the Muslim community in this country as a fraud 7 years ago. If you want to push the metadata narrative, at least get a somewhat plausible story. This has nothing to do with Monis, and that's so obvious.
Yep. Perfectly summed it up.
Well, I tell you what, it's probably is time to move on to the next topic, if you guys are cool with that. Before I do, I just wanted to point out that we are paying attention to the live chat box. More than 40 live listeners today, so we've broken a new record, Zac. The people love you. What can we say? A few things. Jaden says that he can hear the bloody crows in the background. Yeah, we've moved to a new room in the house to do the broadcast, and that window isn't closed. So just get used to the crow, guys. He's as good as a new panelist now. You know, they say that crows are actually a very intelligent bird, and that particular crow, I'm pretty sure he's the same guy who always sits out the front of my window when I'm in bed asleep, and he sits atop a house of one of my neighbours, and I actually think that crow might be more intelligent than my neighbours. I hear them watching television, and tonight, oh goodness gracious. A few other comments. Silver Slave says, I don't know why they bother with the false flags when the sheeple aren't paying attention to the laws anyway. And sadly, I think that's actually kind of correct. It's almost as though they're just going through the motions with the false flags. They can change the laws, and people in this country, at least, are so asleep. What are they going to do about it? The vast majority of them don't even know, let alone care. And what I find fascinating is when I speak with someone who seems somewhat awake, somewhat attentive to what's going on, somewhat concerned about the future of this country, I'll bring up certain laws that have been passed in the last 6 months, and they go, really? Really, they can do that? They can come into your house and not issue you a warrant for up to 12 months? They can come into your house in plain clothes? Really? They can cancel your passport and not tell you for up to 12 months? Are you sure that law's passed, or is it just a proposal, Johnno? No, I'm telling you, that's actually the law as of a couple of months ago. Really? I'll have to go and look into that. That's how asleep this country is, that even some of the people who seem like they'd naturally be more concerned have no idea what's getting passed. We're almost at the point where they don't have to bother with the false flags. Just pass the laws already. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. The passiveness is just increasing, and that's why they need to continuously pump these events out, because the faster it progresses, the faster they need to continuously stronghold the perceptions of the public.
Yeah, well, I think it ties into something that Truthfire said in the live chat, which was divide and conquer. They want us to be in a constant state of fear instead of love, and I think they've achieved that now. They've got everybody in such a state of fear, tuned into the 6 p.m. bulletins, fear, 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 worry, 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 bad, 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 that most people have tuned out. That's what's happened, because they've got us in this constant state of fear, which the TV can do. If you could eliminate televisions tomorrow for just a week, I think everything would change just like that, overnight, within the space of a few days, because the TV is used to drive that fear into people and make them not want to pay attention to what's going on around them. A couple other comments from the live chat box. C-Space6257 looks like a new listener to the show, so welcome. Good to have you on board. Talking about the BRICS being a financial dialectic, and basically what he's saying is he doesn't think the BRIC nations are a solution to our problems because he thinks they're part of the New World Order agenda. If you go back to episode 5 or 6, Ethan, we did cover the whole Russia thing in depth, and because there's so many new listeners to the show who might not be aware, go back through our back catalogue. There's a whole bunch of topics, including the BRICS and Russia, that we've already gone into a lot of detail about. So please, C-Space6257, go and check that one out. The story up says that Red Pill gave the ARP a good shout out on We'll Do It Live, and I noticed that. So the story up, don't worry, we're big fans of Red Pill. Apparently he's big fans of us, and it's good to see that people are cross-promoting one another's shows. And it's like we always say, Ethan, if we can do this show, if Red Pill and Jeff T can do their show, if up north of the 49th and Brian Roberts can do their show, if people can do the shows like we can, anyone can do it. Yep. So everyone's cross-promoting each other now. It's fantastic. If you want to start your own show, guys, do it, and we'll cross-promote you the same way that Red Pill's been cross-promoting us. So thanks to the story up. And finally, Gary Mack on Tenaste says that They push multiculturalism on us, and then the psyops are used to get us to hate the people that they've led into the country. And I agree 100%. People need to see through these dual narratives. If you can't see that the whole thing's a psyop, at least realise that the media is trying to push two different ideas into your mind, and neither of them go together. And before I get on to the next topic, guys, just from those comments that I've read out from the listeners, what are your thoughts?
I think each comment there was spot on, and it's good to see a community. As I said at the start of this show, we didn't expect to have 3 listeners rather than people tuning in live. It's good, and it's good that we. Once again, I just love that we're continuously building a community, and it's good to interact with people to push. To push this idea, to push the resistance against this control system, because it's coming to get us, Zach.
Yeah, it's surprising how many people are actually waking up. Like, I've noticed it myself in my personal life, just how many people don't trust the government anymore, just don't believe what they say. Everything they say, they assume it's a lie.
It's like a number of people are saying this movement now. It's at the point where really, every time you see an event on the TV, the logical thing is to think, well, this is probably a hoax. I'm going to believe it is until they provide evidence that it was real. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the last couple of days, there was that incident in Belgium where supposedly there was a terror raid and 2 terrorists were just killed. Now, I haven't spent any time looking into that one. I've been too busy looking into other things. But if someone were to say to me right now, I've looked into that and it looks like a hoax, I'd say, well, that's no surprise. Like, it's not a surprise anymore when people say this. A couple of years ago, if you said to me that something was a hoax, I'd say, really? Like, are you sure? Like, that's a big deal. It's not such a big deal. They're happening with such regularity now that really, if there was another hoax in Brisbane or Melbourne tomorrow, I mean, I'd follow it closely because it's in our country, but really, it wouldn't surprise me. That's the stage that we're at now.
I think, Johnno, that they just need to kind of, like you were saying before, just do one just so they can have an excuse to pass this law. They're not quite at the stage of just passing the law for no reason yet. They just need to kind of, put together some sort of chamois, false flag, and as long as they call it a terrorist attack, then they'll get more terror laws passed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There still is a dwindling resistance that actually pay attention to these laws, and they do need the false, loosely constructed, just hoax events as the justification to do it, and that's how they're getting it through. But in terms of the masses, in terms of their passiveness towards the issues that are happening, it just seems like you could, as you mentioned in a previous episode, pass the Stasi Germany Act. And it would go through.
They could literally call the bill. They could introduce a new bill to Parliament, I believe this, in Australia, and call it the Stasi Germany Act 2015, and the only people who'd be talking about it in the so-called media, if we expand the term media just to anyone who's doing this kind of work, the only people who'd be talking about it would be people like us.
Yeah.
You would not hear about it in any critical way from any of the mainstream press. At best, you might get a few token articles against it to keep up this false idea that they actually are there to report on the truth. But really, they're all part of a much bigger scam, and that is pushing us towards a totalitarian state. At the same time, I do like what you said before, Zach, that more people are waking up. They certainly are. And I don't just base that on the fact that this show is growing so quickly and those other shows are growing so quickly. I mean, even when I talk to people on the street, occasionally someone will surprise me and go, yeah, man, this is all fake. And that never used to happen. I mean, I don't go out and talk about these things very often, but if a topic comes up in conversation, I'll keep my ear out there and I'll see what people are saying. And slowly but surely, I'm hearing more people say, nah, there's something fishy about that. There's something fishy about that. In fact, I'm hearing that one a lot. There's something fishy about that. It's still a minority of people, but like I always say, we don't need the masses on our side. You only need a few % of people who are awake and who are active, and you can change everything. So whilst I do sit here and criticise my neighbours for watching the 6pm Bulletin and probably thinking that it's all real, whilst I criticise those people and I talk about how clueless most Australians are, I never lose sight of the fact that slowly but surely the people are waking up, and with every sloppy psyop, that's only going to increase.
Yep. As I've pointed out in previous episodes, I've seen especially in Australia, from the very beginning of when Australian alternative media first started to progress, and the difference in reception and how quickly it's increased over the years. It's always inspiring, and we do need to continue to build a community of like-minded people, because we're not going to combat them head on. We need to be together.
I'll tell you who's part of our like-minded community, and that's Die Man in the live chat. And he just asked a question, did I just hear a fart? And the answer is no. That's the paper towel that we have here to wipe the sweat off our brows, because it's a steaming 38 degrees up here, and that air conditioning is doing nothing. I tried to tell you guys, you wouldn't listen. Now, it's time to move on to the next topic, and that is... More taxpayer-funded propaganda. Now, we're going to move on from the terrorism thing, but we're going to stay on propaganda because there's so much of it now. I'm going to talk about some money that's being spent by our government to convince us to believe something that's not in our best interests. So, I'll get straight into it. Back on episode 9 of the Australian Roundtable, I spent some time talking with guest Zac A about the proposed so-called higher education reforms. And by the way, Zac A, if you're listening, mate, hope you're doing well. Now, I say so-called higher education reforms because the use of the term reform implies that the system is being somehow improved, when in fact it is being even further corrupted by moneyed interests. The basic rundown of the proposed changes is that the federal government plans to deregulate university fees to allow universities to set their own prices for degrees. Currently, all universities in Australia, with the exception of one, regardless of stature or prestige, can charge no more than a maximum amount of money for a degree as set out by the federal government. Bear in mind that most domestic university students in Australia take out government loans for the entire cost of their tuition, which they pay back once they get a job. The proposed changes would mean that all universities, in particular the 8 elite ones in this country, could raise their fees by as much as 200%. And of course, the vice-chancellors of the elite universities have been vigorously supporting these changes, promoting them as good for students. They fail to mention how much their own pay packets will swell should the changes pass. Now, those who have been indoctrinated into believing in the mythical free market will say that it is good to let universities charge as much as they like, engage in price competition, etc. Except there is no real price competition when the government is picking up the bill, and most people in this country still support student loans from the government. But more importantly, there is no free market in this country when it comes to the control and regulation of money and use of violence. And so long as one organisation has a monopoly control on the creation and regulation of money, as well as a monopoly control on violence, there is no such thing as a free market. Everything in this country is priced in that monopoly-controlled money, and no scores can be legally settled through violence except by the state. So any talk of a free market is laughable to anybody who is not beholden to the indoctrination meted out at schools, universities and television about the mythical free market. Now anyhow, on the topic of higher education in Australia, it deserves its own feature piece, and I'm sure we're going to give it broader coverage at a future date, Ethan. Yep. But today I just wanted to quickly comment on something that I saw in The Age a week or two ago. This is from The Age, another Fairfax publication down in Melbourne. Abbott government spends $8 million on higher education blitz. This is from January 11, 2015. Quote, the Abbott government has splashed more than $8 million of taxpayer money on a media blitz promoting its stalled higher education reforms. Fairfax Media can reveal the government has spent $5.4 million on media bookings for the campaign, which has infuriated key Senate crossbenchers. This comes on top of $2.3 million spent on the design of the advertisements and $560,000 on focus groups and market research, end quote. So taxpayer money is being used to influence the taxpayer to support the deregulation of university fees so that the taxpayer, their families and friends, their children and so forth, can go further into debt just to get a piece of paper to get them into the over-credentialized workforce. And sure enough, you can expect that the partisan fools who fall for the false left-right paradigm will use this as an excuse to criticise the governing Liberal Party. But the article goes on, quote, the government will counter attacks on the spending by pointing out that the amount is dwarfed by the $21 million Labor spent in total promoting its Gonski school funding changes, end quote. And this is why I always say that anybody who still thinks that there is a real difference between the major parties is a fool. No matter which of the two is in power, they're going to spend taxpayer money trying to fleece the taxpayer into paying more money to the state. That is what a corrupt state does. And no learned person can deny that our state, the organisation which demands money from you with the threat of imprisonment, is utterly corrupt. Never forget that if you refuse to pay your taxes, they will come for you armed with guns. Anybody who believes the government is my friend, especially in this day and age, is a moron. Now, at some point in the future, I'm going to put together a feature piece on the quagmire that is higher education in Australia, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. But boys, based on what I've just read out, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, the government-funded loans really infuriate me, because it's kind of this trap that is so hard to escape. First of all, you need the piece of paper to get a job, but then you can't get the piece of paper without paying $40,000 for 3 years of uni, where it's $1,000 a week to go to lectures where there's 300 students in the lecture theatre. And they make it so impossible to bypass this system, and yet they keep screwing you over because they can loan you as much money as you want. You have to pay whatever it costs. So you end up paying exorbitant amount of money for this education, which is quite subpar in my opinion.
And as the workforce gets more and more oversaturated, more and more of the jobs now require that you do have this piece of paper. As it gets worse, the conditions as to get this piece of paper, the alternatives are getting less and less, because now every job you need, at least a diploma level for most major jobs that are successful, as opposed to back in the day where people used to leave school at year 10 and could go into jobs and whatnot. It's just completely been diminished, and as the government get further into their own self-controlled economic destruction, it accentuates even more that now education is becoming more increasingly harder, and the people that are making these laws had free education back in the day.
Yeah, well, that's right. My parents had free education. It didn't cost them a cent.
It's just unbelievable, and that's why I was lucky that I awoke to this false paradigm earlier on in my life when I was still in early high school. I awoke to this, and then I understood the farce that the education system was, and that I could still, if I had the initiative, achieve what I wanted to without that. So I've only done education that I've had to do, rather than you are institutionalized until a certain age, treated as a child, then you're told, all right, make a decision for your life right now. What are you going to do for the rest of your life? And you're forced into another institute where you could go into debt. And most of the people that I know, in their first year, they've dropped out, or in their first year, they've changed their mind as to what they want to do. It's just a system where it's become a herd thing, where now you have to go to uni. It's the accepted norm now, and it's ridiculous.
And now your HECS debt is like the mortgage of our generation. It's gonna be $40,000 or $50,000, and you're gonna be paying it off for the rest of your life, probably.
Yeah, and that's if you're lucky. I mean, people are already spending up to that amount of money for their degrees. We deregulate them; they could go up by 200%. So you're talking about six figures all of a sudden. And it really becomes so clear that this is just like indentured servitude. Once upon a time, you wanted to go to a new land, the promised land. So the deal was, we will get you over to the new land, and you'll be free to do whatever you want after you've served us for a period of time, whether that's a few months, a few years, whatever. It's called indentured servitude. The idea is you're going to trade a certain portion of your life to get what comes with that deal, the freedom, right? Well, it's the exact same thing with tertiary education now. If you get a $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 loan that you have to take out and then pay back when you get a job, in the years that it takes you to pay back that loan, that's essentially you doing your indentured servitude time. And once you've finished paying off that loan, now you can start looking at going and getting a house and paying a mortgage for that. So you see, it'll start from the moment that kids leave school, they're going into debt for their future, just to get a job that once upon a time you could get internships for, that you could get clerkships for. Why is it that now to do jobs that didn't take any formal education in the past, now you need a 3 or even sometimes a 4-year tertiary degree? Why is that? It hasn't happened by accident. I like to ask people, why do you think this has happened? If you think that everything happens by chance, you're a fool. But you can de-fool yourself. Stop watching the television and start thinking, why do you think this has happened? Who benefits from this? Think about it. Who benefits from taking an entire group of people and ensuring that from the moment they leave school to the moment they die, they're in debt? Think really hard about that one. Who could possibly benefit? Well, it's the people who lend out the money, isn't it? Now, do these people have enough power to control certain policies that governments enact? Well, of course they are. And I've got a quote here from Bad Wolf, and I haven't had a chance to double check this quote, but I'm pretty sure I've seen this before. This is from Napoleon Bonaparte. Financiers are without patriotism and without decency. Their sole object is gain. I haven't had a chance to double check that quote, but even if Napoleon never said it, how true is that?
Absolutely. It's just it's just a whole system, and it really is. It used to have some, in the eyes of people, it used to have some form of merit. You know what I mean? It used to be legitimate because you could go out and then get that job. Now, you're not even guaranteed that you're going to get that job anymore. You're going to go into debt and get a degree, and then you're going to end up on what our welfare system here is in this country. It seems like more and more it's just indoctrination and putting you in debt, which both serve the agendas of the powers that be.
They're getting you to go into indentured servitude to be indoctrinated into believing in statism.
But being in debt is the best way to control people.
Absolutely. I mean, that and also having them in fear. So if you can get them to go into debt, and then they can't even get a job, they have to work hard, take whatever conditions they can get to get the job, they come home, they put on the 6 p.m. news, and there's more fear, fear, fear. You have got a human being. If it's a kind of evil person who wants to farm humans, you've got them exactly where you want them, completely and entirely in your control. And really, the truth of the matter is that many Australians, in every direction from where we sit right now, that's the situation they find themselves in today in 2015.
Yep, and that's why I'm completely opposed to, obviously, the mainstream media, because I run an alternative news site, but also education. When I discovered early on, because I excelled very well at education, but I was opposed to it, and I have always been opposed to it, and I understood that it's going to be hard, but I can work around the education system. I don't have to put myself in this much debt. I don't have to do this, you know what I mean? It was a personal decision that I made to do that, because you don't have to fall victim to this system. There are ways that you can get around it.
Well, I got an idea for the New World Order. Here's what I would do if I were them in the future. Every person who can't pay back their HECS debt is now a criminal. That's another level of fear, to pay back your debt. And you'll always be in fear of not paying back your debt and being in prison for being a criminal for something. I mean, it's a 100-page contract that you have to sign when you get a HECS debt. There's absolutely a clause somewhere in there that says they can change the terms or conditions and make it whatever they want.
Well, let's not forget that when these so-called higher education reformers were first mooted, they weren't just going to deregulate the amount the universities were charging. They were also going to start adding an interest rate onto the loans, including ones that had already been taken out. So for our international listeners, a HECS debt or a HELP debt, whatever it's called now, they keep changing the name of it. Basically, you take out the loan and then you pay it back when you get your first job, up until you earn something like $50,000, $55,000 a year. So a certain threshold, you don't have to pay it back, and it just goes up with inflation. So if the consumer price index, if the inflation rate is 3%, then the amount that you owe goes up 3% per year, i.e. no interest. They wanted to then make it so that people who taken out these loans wouldn't just be paying back the principal plus CPI, they'd be paying back interest on the loan at the government bond rate. Now, No James in the live chat box said that these aren't government loans, these are taxpayer loans. Well, without getting into a big debate about the overall monetary policy, I'd point out the fact that these dollars that we're talking about aren't even printed. They're just ones and zeros on computers, which, if we the people took over control of our own monetary system, we would control. And these myths that, if the government, I mean, a proper government, not the corrupt one that we have now, but if we the people controlled our monetary system, it wouldn't work. Well, tell me how the monetary system is working right now when we have international financiers controlling everything. Tell me how this is working. It's ridiculous. And I meet so many people who have the indoctrination. I mean, people think that arts students are indoctrinated, and yes, they are. It's a terrible thing. But so are business and commerce and finance students indoctrinated into thinking that there's this thing called the free market, even though a single organisation controls all of the money in circulation. If everything else is priced in those dollars, how do you have a free market? They're indoctrinated to believing the free market, because then they'll support privatisation, which helps the financiers. They'll support all of these policies that don't help the people, they help the financiers, because they believe in this thing called the free market. But at the exact same time, they're taught to believe that you need a central bank, which is the opposite of a free market and is fundamental to everything else. So you see, from the time an 18-year-old gets to his first finance class or his first accounting class 101, he's indoctrinated with this nonsense notion that there's such a thing as a free market, but you need to have a central bank at the heart of it. It doesn't make any sense. But if you indoctrinate people into believing that, most of them will never break out of it. So when people tell me, you have to deregulate university fees to let the free market, I'd be happy to have a free market. Let's start talking about a free market. Let's get rid of the central bank.
That's right. That's the root of the problem.
It's the root of the problem. And Mr. 79 Sav in the chat box says, how about the franc this week, the Swiss franc? Don't worry, Mr. 79. When we get into the international segment, we're going to be discussing the Swiss National Bank and the franc, and we're going to do a lot on that. But before we do, boys, any final thoughts on higher education so-called reforms, governments using our own money to propagandize us? Any other thoughts before we move on?
Just break the chains. Break the chains. It's modern-day slavery. And if we identify it and build a community to resist it, we can get past it. We can get past it one day. What do you think, Zac?
Yeah, I think it's government-sanctioned slavery. I think they incentivize the university route so strongly with, Centrelink support and everything, and the fact that it's a non-interest debt, and it's just so attractive for young 18-year-olds to go, yeah, I'll just go to uni. I don't know exactly what I want to do yet. And then you get another 3 years of government indoctrination that you get to pay for.
That's right. You're paying for it. So
yeah, one final question I would ask people who say, no, people should have to pay for their university education, they get a benefit from it, whatever. Okay, let's extend that logic to high school. Do you want people to start taking out loans to go to high school? I mean, where do you draw the line, and why do you draw the line there? There is no logical argument for making people even pay for university in the first place. If you're not going to make them pay for other education, you have to draw an arbitrary line. And why do you draw it at university? Because you've been indoctrinated into thinking that that's normal. And they're so powerful with their indoctrination that they've managed to, in the space of 2 generations, go from free education to you're spending your entire 20s paying off the debt. And then if you've got a kid, if you're listening out there to this podcast right now, I don't care what you think about the presenters on this show today or even the show itself. I want you to think about this. If they've managed in the space of 2 generations to get people from getting free tertiary education to paying it back over 5-10 years, where do you think they're going to stop?
Yeah.
If you're not going to stop them right now, where do you think they're going to stop? These people would be happy to enslave you and your children and their children for their entire lives. Why wouldn't they? If you're going to let them, that's exactly what they're going to do. The time to start doing something isn't in the future, it's right now. And these kind of conversations, whether it's over a water cooler at work or in the car on the way home with your kids or whatever, the time to start talking about these things is now, because that's the first step. Now it's...
And I thought tertiary education was supposed to be about learning and stuff. How can you discriminate against poor people? If people can't afford to do tertiary education, shouldn't they have the right to do it if they're smart enough? And you're also giving the opportunity to people who don't deserve it, who are wealthy. That's not fair, is it?
I'll put it to you like this with education. We should have a broader discussion about this in a future episode. Make it a whole thing for the episode. We'll talk about this topic of education, the broad one, not just tertiary education, but education in general. I'll tell you this right now. I would sooner trust my kid to Zac for a day to teach him whatever you want, as long as you promise not to teach him any climate change nonsense. I would trust my kid to you for a day, teach him whatever skills you think he's going to need. Then the next day he can go and hang out with his Uncle Ethan. I would rather that than to send him to a school with teachers I've never met, who got their degrees from universities I've never been to, whose curriculums are set either in the central government of that state or even by our national government in Canberra 1,000 kilometres away. It's ridiculous that you would send your kid to be educated by these people. Say whatever you like about them. Why would you send your kids to them if you trust the people around you that they have some sense in their minds? Now, if you don't trust the people around you to be smart enough to educate your kid, why are you hanging out with them in the first place? And more, I talk to people about these things, and more people are saying to me, Johnno, I feel the same way. And you know what? I've got some friends who are thinking the same way. Now, how many of them ever end up buying their own land and educating their own kids and having their own communities? Obviously, there are dreams and then there are realities, and the two don't always coincide. But the fact that people are having this conversation saying, I don't want to trust my kids to the state anymore, that's crazy. You've got to remember, like in the US, they have homeschooling. It's not such an obscure thing. In this country, if you homeschool, you're crazy. I mean, there's no... It is... This country is so controlled. It's incredible. But even in this country, people are saying, no, there's something wrong. There's something very wrong. And that's despite the fact that most people in this country don't even know the first thing about Common Core. Just wait till that starts getting more mainstream. More and more people are waking up, and it's fantastic to see. Now, we do have to move on to the next topic, Zac, so we'll discuss education again at a future time. Let's move on to the international topic now. And the first topic of the international segment today, boys, is, of course, the Swiss National Bank happenings that have taken place in the last week or so. Now, this is going to be a large segment, so I want the audience to bear with me, but I've got a lot of material on this, and this is a very important topic. While I'm doing that, it looks like Zac's just going to go and answer his phone, which is left not on silent. You silly bugger. Now, let's get into it. The Swiss National Bank monetary policy change. On episode 8 of the Australian Roundtable podcast, I spent some time discussing the Swiss gold referendum, which was being held that same day, and also went into some detail on the comical coverage of the event by the corporate media, including our own here in Australia, and tied that into the outright swindle of the American taxpayers by the ruling elite in their country in what was known as the bailouts. Of course, the referendum was voted down by a reported margin of almost 3-1. Now, in the past week, the Swiss Central Bank has again made world headlines after a decision which should be of interest to all people, especially in the developed world. Today, I want to cover these developments from 2 separate angles. A, the basics of what happened, the surface reason as to why it happened, and the macro consequences which follow from it, and how this affects us all. And B, an interesting tidbit which doesn't seem to be getting much mention in the corporate media. Now, in future episodes, I'll go into more detail about why money is at the heart of everything. Most people know this on an intuitive level, but few people even understand how the money in their own wallet works or how it came to be, much less the greater financial systems at the heart of world governance. Now, I don't have time to go into that today, but my hope is to shed some light today on what happened this week in Switzerland and why it's every bit as important as the false flag psyop in Paris a week or two ago. So, part A. First, here's a primer. This is from Reuters. The article is entitled Swiss Central Bank Stuns Market with Policy U-Turn. This is from January 15. Quote, the Swiss National Bank shocked financial markets on Thursday by scrapping a 3-year-old cap on the franc, sending the currency soaring against the euro and stocks plunging on fears for the export-reliant Swiss economy. Only days ago, SNB officials had described the 1.2 francs per euro cap, introduced in 2011 at the height of the Eurozone crisis to fend off deflation and recession, as a policy cornerstone. The U-turn sent the franc nearly 30% higher against the euro in chaotic early trading, coming a week before the European Central Bank is expected to unveil a bond-buying program to counter deflationary pressures. It fed speculation that this quantitative easing QE scheme will be so big that the SNB would have struggled to defend the cap. End quote. Now, basically, I know most of our listeners will know this, but for those who aren't aware, a currency peg works like this. Country A pegs its currency to that of country B by continually buying and selling as much of country B's currency as is necessary to keep their relative values at a steady planned level. For instance, a manufacturing country like China might decide to peg its yuan to the US dollar. By buying up lots of US dollars with its own currency, the Chinese central bank puts upward pressure on the USD and downward pressure on the yuan, due to simple supply and demand. China officially unpegged its dollar from the USD a few years ago. I'm just using this for an example, but you get the idea. That's how you peg a currency, and many countries do it. Many countries have done it in the past. So anyway, back in 2011, Switzerland pegged its franc to the euro. Too many people were parking their cash in the safer Swiss currency due to fears about the euro and effectively bankrupt countries like Greece. This meant the franc's value was rising, again, supply and demand. The SNB felt this might be detrimental to the national economy, so they pegged the currency at a cap of 1.2 francs to the euro. Now, if we go back to the article I read, the title was Swiss Central Bank Stuns Market with Policy U-Turn. What's interesting is that when you go back to the articles from 2011, their decision to initially peg the currency also stuns the market. This is from The Guardian from 6 September 2011. Swiss bid to guard safe haven franc to the euro stuns currency traders. Quote, Switzerland sparked fears of a new currency war on Tuesday after it pegged the Swiss franc against the euro in an attempt to protect its economy from the European debt crisis. End quote. Now, I've got more material there. We're going to try and get through this as quick as I can because it's a hot day and we're running out of time. But the point is, just as people were stunned this week when they got rid of the peg, they were stunned when they first brought it in. I'll provide a whole bunch of links on AusRoundtable.com to make it more clear to people why the peg was initially brought in and why they got rid of it. I encourage people to go and check those out. But I'm going to skim through a lot of this material that I had ready because I want to get through this segment as quick as I can so we get into the discussion. I want to read out now an article from The Guardian, US Federal Reserve to end quantitative easing program. This is from October 30, 2014. Quote, the US Federal Reserve has called time on its $4.5 trillion with a T bond buying program, halting a radical monetary policy introduced nearly 6 years ago to steer the world's largest economy through the financial crisis. The central bank, led by Janet Yellen, the US Federal Reserve has called time on its $4.5 trillion bond buying. See what happens there, guys? When you try and put these articles together and you copy and paste, you stuff it up. All right, I'll fast forward. Quote, it brings to an end a program which marked a departure for US monetary policy when it was launched in December 2008, hugely swelling the Fed's balance sheet in an effort to prop up a battered financial system. The Fed began to slow its purchase for treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities in January, but until now it had not confirmed an end date. The central bank has steadily reduced its monthly bond purchases from a peak of $85 billion with a B a month to $15 billion a month. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is this. For the last 6 years, the US central bank has been engaging what we call quantitative easing, essentially printing money. They stopped doing that 2 months ago. And here we are today. Switzerland have decided to unpeg their currency from the euro. Why? Because they know that the euro is about to start the quantitative easing. So put two and two together. The US financial system has only survived for the last 6 years because their Federal Reserve has been printing. And by printing, we of course just mean creating ones and zeros on computers and giving them to banks to take their toxic assets off their books, right? That's the only way the US financial system has survived for the last 6 years. They announced that they're going to stop that, supposedly because their economy is looking better. And what happens? Well, now the euro is going to start doing the exact same thing, which is why Switzerland, at least on the surface, decided to unpeg their currency. Based on that very lengthy and somewhat monotonous explanation that I gave you boys there, what are your thoughts?
Well, they didn't print the money and give it away. They loaned it. You still have to pay it back with interest.
We're all in debt to each other, and none of the countries have it to pay back. It's the quantitative easing is just was the legs that allowed this zombie economy in the United States to continue for as long as it has. And now the euro, with their increased problems that have been generating for the last couple of years. We saw the situation in Greece. We saw the situation in surrounding countries, the austerity measures and the collapse over there. it just seems like now the zombie system's going to go on, and it's going to be used now for the euro. And it's going to be the exact same thing, where money is just printed out of thin air as a means to continue an economy that should have died 5-6 years ago.
And of course, quantitative easing, this term QE, has made its way into the general vernacular now, where a lot of people who haven't ever studied formally or informally finance probably think that this is normal. I mean, it's been 6 years now. It's become normal.
Yeah.
But there's nothing normal about it. Prior to 2008, the idea of the Federal Reserve just printing money to take toxic assets off banks would have been considered crazy. And it is crazy. It's 100% crazy. But that's the new normal. And so what happens is, late 2014, we're told, after 6 years, the American economy is a bit better now. We don't have to do it. But now the ECB picks up the slack. Now, that's not just me putting two and two together. This is an article from Quartz entitled Absolutely Everything You Need to Understand What Happened to the Swiss franc this week. I won't read it all out. This is from January 17, 2015. But here's their conclusion. Quote, the clearest takeaway, it's all but a done deal that the European Central Bank starts a bond buying program of its own at its January 22 meeting. ECB bond buying is akin to adding more to the supply of euros, end quote. So, even on the surface, boys, this should be most concerning for all thinking people. As soon as the US ends its own policy of printing money, the ECB takes up the slack. And for those unaware, the US Fed's recently entered policy of printing money was, as I described, late last year. Okay, 6 years of printing money. Now it's over. Now we've got the ECB. That's why this franc decision, that's one of the reasons why it's so important, because it signals what's coming. And then people will say, well, why do I care if the American economy is a tank? Why do I care if the European Central Bank's economy is tanking? Well, it affects us all. We've got one financial system across the whole world now. And in 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, Australia almost ran out of money. This is a very underreported fact. I've linked to this on AusRoundtable.com before. I'll link to it again for this segment on this episode's page on AusRoundtable.com. In 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, Australian banks almost ran out of cash. And most people don't realise that. So the fact that the American economy is still tanking it, the fact that the ECB is about to start QE, which we've already proven didn't help the American economy, this if it wasn't already clear to you where we were headed as a world economy, as a financial system, if it wasn't already clear to you, the Swiss franc and what they did has to be the canary in the coal mine. It's obvious what's coming.
It's insanity, and it's only going to get worse. It's not going to survive. It's on its last legs, and we've talked about this in our previous podcasts. The economy is only continuing because they're allowing it to continue to force all of these agendas through in time.
Exactly right. So that was part A. Now, part B is a lot shorter, but when I was doing the research for this and looking into it, I did notice something that wasn't being reported in our mainstream press, and even in the international press, didn't seem to be getting much of a mention, but it's fascinating. This is from the Sydney Morning Herald from January 10, 2012. Swiss central bank head resigns after scandal. Quote, the embattled head of the Swiss central bank, Philipp Hildebrand, stepped down on Monday after being caught up in a scandal over foreign exchange trades by his wife. Aware of the critical situation our country is currently facing, and given my responsibility as chairman, I decided to resign with immediate effect, Hildebrand said at a press conference in Bern. Press reports claimed last week that Hildebrand's wife, Keisha, profited after buying $504,000 worth last August, just weeks before an intervention by the SNB to halt the rise of the franc, a move that saw the dollar rise significantly against the Swiss currency. The scandal took a political turn with revelations that the government last month received banking documents concerning Hildebrand's personal trades from Christoph Blocher, chief of the Conservative Swiss People's Party, UDC, the largest in the Federal Assembly. The Swiss weekly Weltwoche, close to the UDC, charged the controversial currency trades were made by Hildebrand and not by his wife without his knowledge, as the central bank had indicated. Last week, Hildebrand insisted he would not step down. Hildebrand's announcement came despite backing at the weekend from Swiss President Evelyn Wilder-Schlumpf, who said he should not resign, end quote. So, let me repeat that. Although the corporate media tells us that the markets were stunned when the peg was first announced, it seems that the wife of the then head of the SNB was not so stunned. She made a killing out of it. Now, the current chairman of the SNB took over following that very scandal. Here is what he said at the time. This is from the New York Times. Swiss Central Bank taps new chairman, April 18, 2012. Quote, Thomas Jordan was named chairman of the Swiss National Bank on Wednesday, ending uncertainty about the central bank's ability to defend a cap on the value of the franc. Mr. Jordan, a well-regarded economist who has worked for the Swiss National Bank since 1997, has been heading the institution on an interim basis since January, when Philipp Hildebrand resigned over a currency trading scandal. Mr. Jordan immediately reiterated his commitment to defend the cap that was imposed to stop investors. desperate for a safe haven from the euro crisis, from driving up the value of the franc to levels that make exports uncompetitive. In recent weeks, markets have tested the limit of 1.2 francs per euro that has been enforced since September 6. It's clear that I stand for continuity, Mr. Jordan said at a news conference. The minimum exchange rate is absolutely essential for the current economic situation. The whole governing board is fully behind this limit, which we will defend regardless of what happens on financial markets. End quote. Regardless of what happens on financial markets. And yet here we are just a couple of years later and they've unpegged their currency. Again, something is going on here, boys. It may just be that the euro is about to get hammered. It may be something more, but something's definitely going on here. One final tidbit to round out the segment and bring into sharper focus the relevance of all of this to everybody listening to this podcast right now. From the SNB's own website. Quote, Thomas J. Jordan is a member of the board of directors of the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, in Basel, and the steering committee of the Financial Stability Board, FSB. End quote. I'm going to read out to round out this segment a quote from Carol Quigley of Georgetown University. This is a lengthy one, but you have to get this one, so please bear with me. Quote, the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank in the hands of men sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. End quote. Again, that's from Professor Carol Quigley of Georgetown University in his book Tragedy and Hope on page 324. So, tying all of this together, Carol Quigley himself, a man who knows far more about this than just about anyone on the planet. And people, a lot of our listeners know who Carol Quigley is, and they're nodding their heads knowing exactly what I'm talking about. If you don't know who Carol Quigley is, he's one of the 3 authors that you have to read if you want to understand what's happening in this world today. He was a mentor of Bill Clinton. He wrote Tragedy and Hope, a huge book worth every page of reading. It explains everything that's happening. He says the plan from the start was a financial system, its apex at Basel, Switzerland. And here we are today discussing the depegging of the franc from the euro by those same people with connections to the BIS when they had said themselves that they would never do it. The point I'm trying to make here, and I've taken too long to make it, I do apologise for that, but my point is this. There's something happening, guys. I don't pretend to know what it is. Most of the places I check for information about this, they all admit they don't know what's going on. But if 2015 wasn't already set to be a huge year, it is now.
Definitely. Something's definitely happening, and it's going to get really interesting from here on out, Zac, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it sounds like they're getting all their francs decoupled from the euro before the euro crashes, which would be expected if they intend to do quantitative easing.
Well, some videos that I've seen online have predicted that this new system with quantitative easing of the euro is going to be what really heralds the next World War. Eventually, once the economic system is collapsed by design, that's what's going to cause it. And who knows? I don't know. I don't pretend to know what's going to happen, but the next year or two are going to be extremely interesting, and the previous year already proves that, Johnno.
Yeah, and again, I don't have time to go into great detail today about why money and the monetary system and the financial institutions are at the heart of everything, but I'm sure most of our listeners are at least vaguely aware of this fact that behind every war is bankers. All wars are bankers' wars. And right now, something is taking place, and again, I can't pretend to know what it is, but we should be giving it as much attention as we can to try and get our heads around it, because it will be it will precipitate whatever comes next, whatever that might be. So that's why I gave that topic about 20 or 25 minutes. I thank all the listeners for bearing with me, especially because in the heat, half of the paper that I was using has just gone soggy, and I had to just... Anyhow, so that's that topic, boys. Before we move on, do you have any final thoughts on the Swiss franc issue, on money in general? Any final thoughts?
Just continuously follow it. And if you find anything, do send it through to AustralianRoundtable@gmail.com. You know, always stay alert to every facet of this illusional reality that we have, and send it through if you get it, because it's important.
And for any listeners who found what I was talking about interesting just then, again, all the links are at AusRoundtable.com. I insist that people who are interested go and read them for yourselves. I've just taken 6 or 7 articles and trying to give you a basic idea of what I think is happening. You might read the same 6 or 7 articles and come to a different conclusion. Just go and do your own research. It's the best thing that you can do. And hopefully when you're doing it, you won't be doing it in 38-degree heat. You might be able to make more sense of it.
I think the end game of this is hyperinflation, though. I mean, I don't know exactly what's going to happen in the near future, but I think every currency at the moment is doomed to collapse because of the way that they're just printing it with no limitation whatsoever. They just keep printing, and that can only lead to inflation.
And what's fascinating is when you talk to people about nationalising banks or having a monetary system that people control rather than international financiers, they tell you, oh, you can't do that. You'll get massive inflation. There'll be too much money, whatever. Well, hold on. We are printing money. Like, they are printing money right now. If anyone's going to be printing money and handing it out, it might as well be us giving the money to ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, we are living in a zombie financial system. It's so obvious that that's the case. Now, we might as well move on into some of our final thoughts for the day. But before we do, using that topic of the banking system, where I've taken articles from all around the world to construct a narrative for the listeners, I wanted to have a general discussion with you two about information, where you get your information, how you disseminate your information. People say, well, if we can't trust the mainstream media, you know, what can we trust? Or, hey, Johnno, you're using some mainstream media articles to construct your story. You know, how do you decide what's right, what's wrong? Where do you go for your source of information? I've got my sources. Before I elaborate on that, Zac and Ethan, do you want to tell me where you get your own information on these kinds of topics?
I generally, as for this show and for my website, link to mainstream media articles because mainstream media articles give a sense of credibility in some people's eyes, that some people are reading it, they think that there's a false sense of credibility for the controlled mainstream media, but it's a good way to identify, hey, even the establishment is admitting this. But it's a two-way street because you can look at the article on the two-dimensional surface or you can look at what it really means. And what it really means has to come from a deeper knowledge. And that comes from books, from research, through communities like this, through watching documentaries, through educating yourself about what the world is around us. Then you can go through the mainstream media articles and see the hidden agenda behind them. And that's where a lot of people in the mass aren't able to do. So even though you do refer to mainstream media articles, it's because we do have the knowledge behind it to understand what they're really saying, whereas the general person would just think, you know, that it's just another mainstream media article with no context.
Yeah, I totally agree, Ethan. That's very similar to my method. It's surprising how often mainstream media actually incriminates themselves. You really don't need a lot of wacky theories to see the agenda behind it because they often tell you. It's very clear sometimes.
Yeah, and even here in Australia, even though the media is completely controlled, there still are good journalists out there. They're just not headlined on the front pages where Kim Kardashian is, where the new Britney Spears video or whatever's happening. And that's why on tottnews.com, and which I want to make more active with and incorporating videos into it, is the spotlight section, where instead of them being buried behind a lot of mainstream media articles, they are then accentuated on my website as the critical importance that there are, because there are. The Sydney Morning Herald has fantastic writers that talk about surveillance in Australia. There are fantastic journalists here in Australia, but they don't get the attention they deserve because they're just buried behind all of this. So the mainstream media is a good source, but you still need to use books and everything like we do have. I read countless books, look at source documents, always go to the very first source and see how it's developed from there to get your knowledge behind it.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly why at school they barely, if at all, teach this idea of primary evidence and secondary evidence. And so most of the time when I'm quoting from mainstream outlets, whether it's Uncle Rupert or Fairfax or whatever, I try and read out the parts that are primary. If it's a quote from a politician, it's reliable. I mean, even if the overall narrative that's being built in an article is a falsity, they might still quote things that are true. They might still give certain dates that are true. So what I try to do when I'm putting together my stories for this show is I look at the mainstream articles, I take the parts that I think are reliable, I just don't buy into their overall narrative, which is usually one of doom, gloom, fear, terror, whatever. So that's how you can use the mainstream media to your own benefit. Just look for the facts that look reliable, the primary stuff, the secondary stuff, the slants, the opinions, that's the stuff that's rubbish. But you can still find important source information, basic information, in the mainstream press. In terms of getting a better idea of the overall narrative, I think you have to go to the alternative media. And so I've got a number of sources that I use that I want to get into in a moment. But do either of you guys, apart from TOTT News, Ethan, which I know that we're all big fans of, do you guys have any alternative media sites that you like to use that you'd recommend to the listeners?
I enjoy Stormcloud's gathering videos. I think he's quite informative, and you look at all his sources, and he definitely does his research.
In Australia, there's some good alternative news websites that share a lot on social media as well, like realnewsaustralia.com, General Maddox out there. There's obviously Truth News Radio Australia down in Sydney. There's a lot of Australian alternative media that share good information and then write their own original contextual articles and radio sources themselves. And I think alternative media is the way to go, because alternative media give you the alternative perspective that's not displayed by the mainstream media, and the media is the most important thing in this whole spectrum of control, and we need an alternative narrative to get past it.
Well, we are living at the moment in the midst of a war, and the front line of that war is the information war. And at the end of the day, the people who control most of the information that's being consumed are the people on the opposite side of the war to us. However, we have this amazing tool called the internet, which we're using to pierce through that barrier that they have. And it's an amazing thing that we're doing. We're up to, 40-something live listeners at the moment as we make this show. This has only been going for 4 months. There are other shows that are 10 times as big as us who are doing this work. And that's just in the field of event skepticism or conspiracy theories, whatever. There are a whole other people doing their own shows that are on our side, whether or not we realize it, who are also fighting against that central enemy. Whether you are a subscriber to their theories or not, there are groups of people who are fighting for white nationalism or against mass immigration or whatever. At the end of the day, their enemies are the same enemies as ours. And so what I try and do is consume as many podcasts as I can from alternative sources. Sometimes I listen to people and I'm like, this guy has no idea. Or I'll think to myself, well, this guy's just a blatant racist. Like, he's not actually trying to defend his country. He just hates the people who are here. You'll find people who you disagree with. But the more you look, the better the people you'll find. And if I hadn't have been looking, I never would have found the people who I'm trying to emulate with this show. If I hadn't have found them, who knows what I'd be doing right now? Same goes for all the listeners. At some point, you found the show, either because you listened or you looked or someone gave it to you. That's why you need to do the same thing. Keep sharing, keep sharing. If someone recommends you a podcast and you don't think it sounds cool, give it a try anyway. That's the idea of being open-minded. And the more that we all try different things, the quicker we're going to come together as a network. Now, I know that, Ethan, you said to the listeners before the show to stay tuned for your Q&A, and I understand that your original plan was to stop the broadcast and then do the Q&A over the chat box. I've got an idea. I want to pitch this to you two guys right now. How about we wrap this show up now so the official upload ends in a couple of minutes after our final thoughts, but we keep the broadcast going and we'll do the live Q&A as we read the chat box live. We'll just have a general discussion. So the people who tune in live get to hear the post-episode conversation. The people listening afterwards, you just get the 90-minute show. What do you reckon?
Yeah, that was the plan.
Oh, was it the plan? Okay.
That sounds great.
Oh, there you go. Great minds think alike. Well, look, what we'll do, we'll get onto our final thoughts in a moment, just to answer Jaden89's question. Jaden, good to have you back in the chat box as well. I said there are 3 authors that people should check out. The 3 are Carol Quigley, who was the professor at Georgetown University, had access to many of the establishment's files. They gave him access. He even said, I don't even disagree with these people for the most part. Some of the things I do I disagree with, but overall I agree with their agenda. He was probably a Fabian socialist, but he wrote huge tomes explaining exactly how these people work. And like I said, he was a mentor to Bill Clinton. Carol Quigley, from 1910 to 1977. If you want to understand how the world works, you have to read at least one of Tragedy and Hope, or The Anglo-American Establishment. The latter I have studied thoroughly and I can recommend highly. If you want to understand what's going on, you need to read Carol Quigley. The second is Anthony C. Sutton. He was a professor of economics at the California State University, and in 1983 he wrote America's Secret Establishment, which is all about the Skull and Bones at Yale. Skull and Bones being the secret society that in 2004 fielded both of the presidential candidates, George Bush Jr. and John Kerry, and many, many more than that. He also wrote a whole bunch of other books, like How the Soviets Got Their Technology from the Americans or whatever. If you want to understand how the world's working, you have to read Anthony C. Sutton. Just about anything that he wrote is good. My personal recommendation is America's Secret Establishment. Give that a read, you'll love it, then you'll move on to his other work. And the final one is Edward Bernays, who is, of course, a grandfather of propaganda. Now, if you're new to this field of inquiry that we're talking about, this guy might be the best one to start off with, because his book Propaganda is like 100 pages, 120 pages, okay? It's not hard to read. He's actually a good storyteller. It was written like 80, 90 years ago. He explains how you can manipulate the minds of the masses. He doesn't explain how you can do it. He explains how he did it. This is a guy who convinced your ordinary peasants from Australia and America and England to go and fight other peasants in Europe for no reason other than that's what they were told to do. Okay, and he explains how he did it. So, if you're new to all of this, check out Edward Bernay's Propaganda. When you're ready for something that's a little bit more weighty, move on to Anthony C. Sutton's America's Secret Establishment. And then, if you've got about 3 months on a boat to kill, go and check out Carol Quigley and Tragedy and Hope, or The Anglo-American Establishment. Those are the 3 authors. And when I talk about information, when it's topical, I get it from the mainstream press, alternative press. But if you want a foundational understanding of how the world works, you need to read the great authors. And these guys, in their own ways, were terrific authors, terrific scholars, and in Edward Bernay's a terrifically evil man. Now, that's enough of that. We're going to move on to our final thoughts before we wrap up. Zac, as always, we start with the guest. So, final thoughts before we wrap up the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed listening. Sorry I couldn't be more lively today. It is very hot. But, yeah, great topics today. I really enjoyed listening. Thanks for letting me on.
You know, I've been so intent on reading out my segments today and doing a pretty ordinary job, if I'm being honest. I didn't notice it on your shirt, Zac, that's gone all soggy and wet. Is that the Eye of Horus? What is that?
That is a social hierarchy.
We are going to get into that in the post-show conversation. I've got more to say on that. Ethan, final thoughts before we wrap up.
Tune into tottnews.com for the videos and articles that I'm going to be making, dismantling the notion of religious-based extremism and the push for metadata, and plenty of other ideas that we've got on the way. So if you, especially in Australia, if you want to support Australian alternative media like the Australian Roundtable podcast, go to tottnews.com, share the articles, get involved with everything, and you can even submit articles in the About section. You can find out how you can submit articles. I've had a couple of submissions already on the website that we're going to be publishing, so fantastic work. That it's going to be coming out of tottnews.com. And as always, thanks to everyone for tuning in.
And on TOTT News, we spoke last week about how you took a clip from the episode before, put on all of the graphics to go with it, about a 20-25 minute video. Last I checked, that was up to this was about the ballistically impossible excuse for the Sydney siege. Last I checked, it was up to 300 views, right?
Yeah.
I'm asking all of our listeners, if you can do one thing, if I can get you to do just one thing, you don't have to if you can't, but if you could, please go and check out that video on TOTT News, on the YouTube channel for TOTT News. It's a 20 to 25 minute clip that breaks down the ballistically impossible excuse. Most people, when you say to them, hey, here's a 90-minute podcast, listen, unfortunately, most people won't listen to it. But a 20 or 25 minute clip that breaks down in significant detail how the excuse that we were given about the Sydney siege is complete bunkum, there's more of a chance they'll listen. And I think if enough of us watch that clip, share it with friends, do our best to share it. I'm not saying that one will go viral, but that one has the best chance of all the clips that we've done of potentially reaching a greater audience. So please go and check out TOTT News, check out that video and try and share it. Now to my final thoughts. A couple of things. The first thing that I want to announce is that there's some big news. I can't give away too much, but the rumours, Ethan, are that as of next week, the show might go to a slightly different format. Can't give away too much, but look forward to that. If you can, tune in live to next week. Obviously, 4 p.m. Brisbane time every Sunday. I want to say a huge thanks to Red Pill Revolution, who's been promoting our show on his show. He's got 60,000 subscribers. He went AWOL for 2 weeks. Nobody knew where he was. I thought he'd been taken by the Schillerizers. He's come back with a whole new logo, and he seems bigger and better than ever. So thank you, Red Pill, for promoting the show. And people, you need to go and check out, if you don't already, the We'll Do It Live podcast, which is on a Wednesday night American time. That's Thursday morning Australian time. And the Mass Resistance Roundtable, which is Tuesday night American time, Wednesday morning Australian time. These guys are doing great work. The show's a bit more off the cuff and probably a little bit more fun than our show. It's less structured, but I think that's good to get that kind of show where people aren't so worried about trying to get these segments done in succession. But just have a chat, have a general chat. That's all we need to do. The more we discuss, the better for everyone. So go and check out those shows. Again, all of our links will be at ozroundtable.com. I insist that people go and check them out. Thanks to all the live listeners. We've had up to almost 50 people for the live listeners, which is just phenomenal. And we thank each and every one of you for the comments. We'll see you all here again at 4 p.m. Brisbane time, AEST, the Australian Roundtable. Thanks, Zac. Thanks, Ethan. And thanks to the listeners.
Thank you.
Thanks, Johnno.